Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Jammu and Kashmir is a land which has often been described as paradise on earth because of its beauty. However, having been one of the most intensely militarized zones in the world for over 70 years, with an estimate of 700,000 Indian forces stationed there, not a day in Indian-occupied Kashmir goes by when the ground is not soaked in the blood of Kashmiris. According to reports, since 1989, 80,000 Kashmiris have been killed and over 8,000 have been missing in enforced disappearances by Indian forces. Rape as a tool of violence has terrorized generations of women. And now Kashmiris cry out that Indian forces are making systematic efforts to alter their demography. What is most damning is that with all of this, Indian forces enjoy impunity and evade any form of accountability. There is not a house in Kashmir which has not known of the agonizing pain of losing a loved one to violence. There is not a child in Kashmir that is not familiar to the sound of shelling. On tonight's show, we discuss the life of a common Kashmiri who lives under constant surveillance, fear, and pain every day of their life. Joining us for this discussion is Ms. Shaista Safi, who's a journalist from the Islamabad studios. Also joining us is Nayeem Rather, who's a journalist from Srinagar. And joining us is Baba Umar, who's a journalist from Istanbul. Thank you all for joining us. Mr. Nayeem, I'd like to begin with you. So the figures that I stated, 80,000 Kashmiris have been killed and 8,000 have been have disappeared. Is this a realistic figure or is it understated?
Well, I think, if we look at, for example, the civilians or the people, the Kashmiris who have been killed in the conflict, the figures may be, because there can't be an accuracy in the figures. They can be underestimated figures because not everything has been documented in the occupied Kashmir. So as far as, enforced disappearances are concerned, according to some independent, human rights organizations like JKCCS or APDP for that matter, they have put the figures between 8,000 to 10,000 people, and it can be more. I mean, there is no sort of, you can't be very sure about that this is the only figure of the, disappeared people in Kashmir. There can be more than, 8,000 and, so these are rough figures between 8,000 to 10,000.
And Mr. Naeem, here when we're talking about the figures, there being a possible discrepancy, what are the issues in trying to report accurately in Kashmir?
The basic thing is, one has to understand when the counter-rebellion began in India, when the Kashmiris rose up against Indian rule in Kashmir, in Kashmir, and the Indian state, in retaliation, responded with immense brutality, whether it is crackdown or whether it's civilian killings, torture, disappearances. So the atmosphere at that time that the Indian state created in Kashmir was of chaos and immense fear. So the activists on the ground at that time, and still, which is still going on, they find it pretty difficult to actually document the precise number or the precise ways in which the human rights of Kashmiris have been violated in, occupied Kashmir. So when we talk of the figures, or when we talk of what actually is documented, what Kashmiri activists document is the basic, for example, if someone has been subjected to enforced disappearances, people document the case, who he was, or what are the circumstances in which he was, subjected to enforced disappearance, or who were the perpetrators of the crime. So there is not some, because one has to understand Kashmir, there is a war against people going on in Kashmir, and once you are in middle of a war, you are not sure about the figures, because figures always tend to be, understated, and one can't reach to every area to document the things.
And Mr. Baba Umar, when Mr. Naeem talked here about how there is a war going against people, of course that must cause extensive forms of violence. Violence must have been seeped within the life of each and every individual. Tell us about that. How has that impacted everyday life for Kashmiris?
See, what may seem abnormal to the outside world, it's very normal in Kashmir. Kashmiris are used to curfews, searches, gunfire, bombs being, houses being bombed, cowsheds being destroyed. So they're all used to this thing. But in fact, during the recent escalation between India and Pakistan, it may seem irrational to the outside world, but they were seeing an opportunity here. So Kashmir, when the build-up started between India and Pakistan, they were hoarding food, cooking oil, storing fuel, petroleum, not in fear of a war, but in hope of a war. Now this is unreasonable, but Kashmiris have their own reasons for it. They were seeing an opportunity here, and because they are done with the piece of graveyard that only stretches the status quo in the region without offering any solution to the dispute. And they kind of wanted a 7-day or a 14-day war between both countries, a major escalation below the nuclear level, which could have brought international attention back to Kashmir, leading to a dispute resolution process with international backers, of course. See, Kashmiris are sick with the daily wars. They see the wars every day in the streets. Because this is an area which is highly militarized, as you suggested. 500,000 Indian soldiers patrolling the streets and lanes, and there are over 100,000 police and thousands of spies and the government gunmen. So this area is highly militarized, and it is the daily wars which people see. So during the tensions between India and Pakistan, which may seem cooling down, people were kind of disappointed because they seem peace is over. Now it's the time to end their daily wars.
Yeah, and Baba Umar, you make a very important point there, which I'm going to take to Shaista as well, who's a Kashmiri living in Isle. When you witness war every day, then the threat of a war escalating to a point where it warrants international attention does not scare you. Tell us how people have become immune to the everyday war there and how that is dangerous.
Thank you, Meshal. As both my brothers from Kashmir were speaking, that let us be very clear that we are living in an occupation and Kashmir is an occupied territory, and we see Indian occupational forces fingering their triggers, and we see Kashmiris humiliated by the hands of alien occupiers. Whatever escalation we have seen after Pulwama incident, as Baba Umar said, that this is nothing new for us. This is what Kashmiris have seen, what Kashmiris have gone through all these ages. We have seen, as you mentioned in your introduction, that more than 80,000 people have been killed. And as Naeem correctly said, that it may be underestimated. It may be more than 1 lakh people have been killed. Thousands have been raped. Thousands have gone disappeared. Children are often there. And we, on everyday life, we see that Indian occupational forces are stationed every 10 yards apart, and we have to go through the checkpost, we have to prove our identity to the alien occupier. So all these things which we see on the in our early childhood, in our youth, while going to the schools and universities, we have to see this occupation every day. So what you are seeing, what the media is showing nowadays, it's what Kashmiris have been going through all these ages. The escalation between India and Pakistan, maybe it's a new thing for the world, but as Arundhati Roy has even recently in her interview said, that this is a blessing in disguise, that Modi is now internationalizing Kashmir issue, and now world is talking about Kashmir is a nuclear flashpoint between India and Pakistan. So whenever Modi or his government or India tries to pressurize Kashmiris and they try to hide their war crimes in Indian occupied Kashmir, something like this happens and Kashmir comes back into the spotlight, and the world understands that, and world should understand that Kashmir is the elephant in the room, and until and unless you don't address this elephant in the room. There can't be the peace which you are talking about. There can't be a peace which world is looking forward to. As Baba Umar correctly said, that Kashmiris are only seeing the peace in graveyards, and we have only been called rest in peace. But Kashmiris deserve peace, and they will be struggling and they will be resilienting against what Indian occupation is doing there.
And that's a very important point that you made there, that it has been realized time and time again that Kashmir serves as a nuclear flashpoint between India and Pakistan. But the number of war crimes that go on under, things that go beyond the politics, things about grave human rights violations, those do not come to the forefront as prominently. So we're talking about how this issue is highly politicized, but in that political conversation, often what the people are facing on a daily basis is not being highlighted enough. Tell us about the war crimes that happen on a day-to-day basis in Kashmir.
Well, there is a huge UN report on the human rights abuses in Kashmir that was unfortunately rejected by Indian government and its media. I mean, that report talks about the rapes, it talks about daily humiliation, it talks about the torture, it talks about killings, it talks about killings which were done to get medals, to get monetary benefits. It talks about the high militarization. So, I mean, human rights abuse, it has been documented in time to time, but it's just that New Delhi which doesn't acknowledge these reports, which is quite unfortunate.
And when we're talking about not acknowledging reports, of course, there's also the fact that there's not any accountability, no sense of accountability for the war crimes that are committed. The Indian forces there enjoy impunity. For that reason, many of the rapes, especially the one in 1991 that took place in the two towns of Jammu and Kashmir, that almost had 150 victims of rape. That was never accounted for. Tell us about how rape has been used as a form of violence and oppression in Kashmir.
See, you're talking about Kundan Poshpura incident of early 90s, wherein some 53 women were allegedly raped by the government forces. Well, even that, when that thing happened, Indian government, they sent out, they didn't send any government official there to research what exactly happened. Press Council of India's head, B.G. Varghese, he went there and he did the research for the Indian government, declaring that all the women were lying and all that. So the issue is the government, Indian government, has not genuinely held, they're not holding any inquiries or accountability commissions which could tell what exactly happened in Kashmir. And when the outside world tries to draft or research on these human rights abuse, they just declare them null and void. And in fact, not just the government, but Indian media as well. They are in hand in glove with this. They are complicit with whatever the government is doing in Kashmir, and they're sort of they toe the government line on whatever happens in Kashmir. So as long as India doesn't allow any impartial probe, I don't think things will be clear to the outside world what exactly is happening in Kashmir.
That's very true. There needs to be an objective review of what's happening in Kashmir for the outside world to get to know about the true situation. We're also joined by Devika Mittal, who's a peace activist joining us from Delhi. Devika, thank you for joining us. From your point of view, whatever that is happening, especially in regards to women in Kashmir, what needs to be done to get some sort of accountability for it?
I would like to mention that when we are talking about human rights violation in Kashmir, the UN report of 2018, it talked about how both the countries, India and Pakistan, they have been accused, they have been indulging in human rights violation in the valley, in the whole of Jammu and Kashmir. And I do think from the Indian side perspective, the state's perspective, they always show it as if it's a vicious cycle. This is not to say we cannot really justify the human rights violation that is happening in Kashmir when we talk about the law of AFSPA, the things, the PSA, the acts which have been happening, when we talk about the enforced disappearances. Definitely these things have to go. And definitely when we talk about, let's say, what needs to be done, we need to build a culture of trust which has to be there. Without that, without a consensus, without including the stakeholders.
It doesn't seem like a culture of trust can be constructed now. Wouldn't you agree with what Baba Umar said, that there needs to be a third objective party entering Kashmir, reporting on what's happening, providing a true, valid picture of the situation?
The UN has already been doing that. We have seen that. The thing is that there is a geopolitics that exists. Neither India nor Pakistan is actually trying to acknowledge what they have been doing. When we talk about a third party intervention, who that third party has to be, there has to be a decision on that as well.
Okay, so I take your point there. And before we delve deeper into that, Ms. Shaista Safi, I want to ask you, when we're talking about another element that needs to be considered specifically is the children, how they are witnessing this militarized zone, how they take it, how it impacts their psyche, how that impacts their future in return. Tell us more about that. What's happening on that front?
Meshal, before answering to the question you have put, I'd like to say that to Devika, that UN report that appeared on 18 July 2018. It's a 49-page report, and 39 pages are dedicated to Indian-occupied Kashmir, and the rest of the 10 pages are dedicated to the other side, Azad Kashmir. The report clearly says that there can be comparison between what is happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir and what are the administrative faults in the Pakistan side of Kashmir. So we have to be clear with the fact that Indian-occupied Kashmir is a disputed territory. There are Armed Forces Special Powers Act, there is Public Safety Act. People are being killed there, women are being raped, women is being used as a weapon of war, as we have been discussing Kunan Poshpura. And how can we forget about Asifa, the 8-year-old child who was brutally tortured and raped in Jammu? And how can we forget Asifa and Nilofer? How can we forget Muniba, the bride who was raped on her wedding day? So we have to be realistic, and we have to leave this ostrich approach that whenever it comes to Kashmir, we put blame on the other side. We have to understand that right now Kashmir, Indian-occupied Kashmir is boiling. Right now Indian-occupied Kashmir, people in Indian-occupied Kashmir are suffering. As far as the question is concerned, women and children are the most, every segment of the life is disturbed when it's an occupation, but women and children suffer the most. We have seen how Kashmiri children are raised up in conflict, that we are not normal people. We have to be raised differently. We live in resistance. We live in occupation.
Shaista,
and we grow up differently.
The point, Shaista,
we have
the
to
point
see
that you
every day.
made
We have
here
to see the
in to how there cannot be a false equivalence drawn between what's happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir and Azad Kashmir. I'd like Devika to reply to that, to respond to that. How do you see that?
First of all, I was not justifying what Indian state has been doing. Let me
But
just
it's about drawing a false equivalence between both
I
of
was
them.
drawing a parallel just to say this thing, that when we talk about Kashmir, we're only looking at what the Indian side is doing. I'm not saying that we should not, let's say, or we should just think about what
Because
Pakistan is doing, but it's important to look at that as well, because the UN report had said this thing, that Pakistan, what it has been doing in the Pakistan side Kashmir, it's more about not allowing them to even, let's say, have an association. There is no freedom of media in Pakistan. This is a fact that we all do know.
Comparing freedom of media to the war crimes that are taking place systematically on a day-to-day basis.
What I've been trying to say is that there are different narratives. If we are only looking at one narrative, then it doesn't help.
But
it's not been helping.
But this wasn't looking at one narrative. This wasn't looking at one narrative. This is on the basis of what the UN report stated.
If one house is on fire, and the other is just, there are some administrative issues, you first put water on the house which is on the fire. We'll talk about, yes, there are administrative issues in Azad Kashmir.
You cannot call, let's say, not allowing people to protest as an administrative issue.
You can't have a comparison between what's happening.
Okay,
so I want another voice in this conversation. Mr. Baba Umar, when we were earlier talking about children in Indian-occupied Kashmir, the youngest pellet gun victim, an 18-month-old girl existed there. I would also like for you to tell us exactly how children in this area who are not involved, are not complicit in any form of crime or rebellion, how they have to face life every day?
See, as I said in the beginning, it's all normal there because they have imbibed the abnormality. Now look at this guy who exploded this car bomb in Pulwama on Feb 14. He's just 18 or 20 and he was into rebellion for only 1 year. His family is saying that he was tortured, he was humiliated, he was made to do the rounds of this police gypsy with his nose, and he was humiliated in front of his friends, and he just came out and he couldn't take it more and took out the revenge. Now, look at other, for example, other children who are seeing this daily conflict. They are sort of imbibing all this conflict, and they are reacting to it as well. Now, I just want to reply to Devika. The problem with the Indian peace activists is that they see Kashmir through false binaries, through the binary of India and Pakistan. There is a core dispute of Kashmir, and there are more than a dozen UN resolutions on it.
Yeah.
So I think we should be more focusing on Kashmir than discussing it's happening in Pakistan administered Kashmir as well. Also, I have reported Kashmir from New Delhi as well for around 4 years. I have not heard of mass graves in Pakistan administered Kashmir. I have not heard of 10,000 people missing there or disappearing in the official custody. I have not heard of dozens of women getting raped. So let's stop this drawing parallel between what's happening in Pakistan administered Kashmir and India administered Kashmir. In fact, the UN report also clearly says that the rights violation in Azad Kashmir are of a different magnitude. They can't be compared with what's happening in India administered Kashmir. Also, you have to see the militarization of India administered Kashmir and the Pakistan administered Kashmir. There are over 500,000 Indian troops in India administered Kashmir. I mean, they're not there on picnic. They are trained to fight. They're trained to be away from the civilians, and they are trained to mistrust civilians. And when you have this much of army at a place, human rights violations are bound to occur.
That's a very important point you made there, and thank you so much for talking to us about it. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss this further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue discussing the ongoing situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir, we are also joined by Dr. Shazia Malik, who's a professor of gender studies, joining us from Srinagar. Dr. Shazia, let's begin with discussing the situation of the half-widows, a term that's come to be known especially for Kashmiri women who have lost their husbands, but they don't know if they've passed on or they have disappeared for some reason. Tell us more about that situation.
Thank you for your question. Kashmir has seen a lot of violence for far too long, and the Kashmir has suffered it silently, and it is the women of Kashmir who have, shared the brunt of this violence. As you said, that the enforced disappearances have given rise to the half-widows. When I say enforced disappearances, it means that security forces, due to the presence of ASPA in the valley, they take away the men of the family without warrant, and the families then don't know the whereabouts of the person.
And how does that impact
this gives rise
women specifically in terms of their ability to earn, their ability to run a household, their ability to raise their children?
Yes, that's entirely a difficult situation for both the widows as well as the crucial, because their status becomes confused one. Because they cannot remarry, they cannot, they don't know the actual status of their husband, and for that they don't even earn the get the property rights of their husband. So, that makes their life more difficult than the widows.
Yeah. And over here, we are talking about those women who have lost their husbands for some reason. But of course, women specifically in Indian occupied Kashmir must face very unique challenges. Devika, what could you tell us about that? What do women face as issues, as challenges in living in a militarized zone?
I would just like to first of all clarify that I was not getting into the whataboutery of things, that who does what, where. Definitely, I'm aware of things which have been happening in the Indian side of Kashmir, what Professor Shazia had talked about as well. The enforced disappearances that have been happening, the half widows, the cases of like the Kunan Poshpora, and the rape cases, the sexual assault cases that we do here, and it's very unfortunate. There are no words that I can have to explain what the state is really doing. What I would like to really focus upon in this is also this, that we need to get into the fact of how do we solve this, how do we resolve this, because this has to end the violations that have been happening, the violations that are actually, let's say, making everyone suffer, the youth, the women, young men, old men, like
Devika,
everyone who is
if you
suffering.
could, in your perspective, in your words, tell us when you're talking about how the youth is suffering, how the women are suffering, how the elderly are suffering, what is exactly happening there? Because of course it's easy to say in generalized terms that it's a very difficult situation, but what specifically are the challenges these groups of people are facing on a day-to-day basis?
There is, of course, unemployment. If we talk about the general issues which are there are very less development projects which are in Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, if we ask about what the Indian state has to say, they will blame the militancy for it. To an extent, of course, that is true as well. The youth, when we talk about stone pelting, which is there is a reason why youth are getting into that, the violent lives that they are living. So all of that is there. When I talked about the women, I already talked about the sexual assault cases that happen, how if the young men are taken away without any sort of proof, which is happening a lot in Kashmir. Of course, it affects the entire family which is there. So if we talk about Kashmir, the development is very low. There are no, let's say, jobs which are there. And if we look at why stone pelting is happening, there are some reasons, and some of these reasons are, of course, is that there is a lot of distrust, there is a lot of disillusionment among the youth. What India had promised, of course, it has not been able to deliver that.
And Devika, when we're talking about India not being able to deliver, after the Pulwama attack, we also saw how Kashmiris all over living in India were under constant threat. Almost 800 had to return home, students. So in this case, do you think ever since the Modi government came into power, the otherization of Kashmiris, not seeing them as your own people, has it also increased?
I think it has always been there. There has always been this, let's say, perspective about Kashmiris, regarding Kashmiris, Muslims, so to say, as of course always being more loyal to Pakistan. This is something which has always been there in India. After the Pulwama attack, it's very unfortunate that Kashmiri students were attacked, they were picked up, they were, let's say, they faced a lot of problem in universities as well. So that's a very tragic thing, but I don't think I can only blame the Modi government for that. Sadly, that has always been the case.
That's an important point to make there. And Dr. Shazia Malik, while we're talking about universities and how education is being hindered, of course, it is becoming something that it has become even of a sort of a privilege to attain as opposed to a basic right. What is the state of private institutions in Kashmir? Does the government allow private colleges and universities to flourish in Indian occupied Kashmir? Is there enough funding for it, or is there a reason why students specifically have to move out of Jammu and Kashmir to seek higher education?
Basically, this is we don't have in Kashmir. There are not many private universities and colleges here. And second, there was this scheme under the government of India long back that they thought that the young generation could be more mainstreamed if they get in touch with the mainland India. And that was the main thought behind that. And there were a lot of schemes generated, which brought a lot of young boys and girls out of the Kashmir Valley. But it seems now that their own motivation has now that's very confusing right now. They are alienating the students there, whom they thought they would mainstream there and get more close to this generation, which is now not actually working. The other thing is that,
Dr. Shazia, you mentioned here how there is systematic alienation of those Kashmiri students who they formerly wanted to integrate within them. But of course, we have to remember in India, there isn't only just an alienation of Kashmiri students, of Muslim students. And Ms. Shaista, I would like for you to shed some more light on how the situation there is for all minorities, including Christians, including Dalits, including Sikhs. How is it in Modi's belligerent India right now?
Well, first of all, let us be very clear again that Kashmir is an occupied territory, and when we talk about Kashmir and we say that we don't know why it's happening, why Kashmiris, there must be some reason that's why Kashmiris are coming out with the stones in their hand. So we have to understand that those Indian occupational forces there, which India called them the security forces, they are there to kill us, they are there to rape, they are there to maim us, torture us, they are there to perform war crimes there. So when we talk about Kashmiri youth coming out on the streets and say that there must be some reason, there is a reason, there is an obvious reason that we are living in an occupation. That's why we are resisting. Coming to your question, that we have seen after Pulwama, we Kashmiris have been crying loud enough and telling to the world that look at the Indian media that portrays Kashmiris as terrorists, look at the Indian media that portrays Kashmiri and give a different narrative of what Kashmiris want. After Pulwama, the world is talking now about the fake news India is showing to the world and how they manipulate and how they spin and twist the truth, the realities. And now world is talking about how Indian media acted, how Indian politicians acted, the warmongering hysteria they are facing through. Now world is recognizing it. We Kashmiris have been victim of this for ages now. We have seen what they have been doing. In India, we have seen that Muslims have been ghettoized and they have been isolated. We saw that Muslims were lynched and they were killed just because they were transporting or having beef in their kitchen or in their refrigerators. The rising and shining Modi's India, which the Bollywood shows, now the real picture, now the reality in face of what Kashmiris are suffering is in front of the world.
And Shaista, hold on to that thought.
Kashmiris have been telling to the world and they have been...
Hold on to that thought while I also... Devika, you stated how there have been lynchings over cow eating and cow killings over here, and a human rights report also stated how 44 people have been killed between 2015 and 2018 and almost 280 injured. Devika, who makes up most of these groups who are victims? It's not just Muslims from what I understand.
It's not just Muslims, it's also the Dalits, it's also the other marginalized groups which are there, the Christians as well. So if we talk about what is happening in India right now, of course you can there is, let's say, the Hindu nationalism which is there, which talks about who is really a Hindu, what really Hinduism means to some people who do claim that they are the true Hindus. So that has been happening, and of course it's not just the Muslims, it's not just the Kashmiris, but others as well who are being, let's say, systematically discriminated, systematically persecuted.
And over here, when we're talking about how various groups of individuals are being persecuted, I want to touch upon the caste system a little here. We're also seeing how in India, there has been almost a the rise in unemployment has been highest as it has been in 45 years. So, of course, the people who bear the brunt of that must be the minorities. Can you tell us about that? How is unemployment affecting the minorities?
Unemployment, of course, it has been one of the challenges for India for a long time. Of course, since the independence, there have been parties which came on the claim of saying that employment will be generated, jobs will be given. But we know that hasn't really happened, or at least not to the level about as to what was really expected or what was actually, let's say, claimed. when we talk about the job scenario in India, of course, there are some groups which have been, let's say, much more left behind than others. The Dalits definitely have been, the OBCs, the SCs, the STs, they have been the groups which have still continued to be, at the margins when we talk about jobs.
And what can you tell us about the farmer situation here? Farmer suicides have risen 42% in Modi years. What is happening on that front?
Farmer suicide, again, it has been there. The thing which has been happening is just that the party has been claiming many things, but somehow we cannot really see any effect, any impact which has been there. The farmer situation is very bad in the country right now, but unfortunately, the media is not even focusing on that. There are other agendas, sadly, which is being much more focused about.
Okay, and we can see here how there is many promises made by the Modi government that have not been fulfilled. Ms. Shaista, while we're talking about India's rule over the Kashmiri people, do you think after what happened in Pulwama, how you stated, how the media reacted, how the government reacted, it is becoming more and more clear that India has been acting as an imperial power?
Look, Meshal, as I said earlier, that we Kashmiris are used to what you and what world has seen after Pulwama, war-mongering hysteria and the fuel firing and whatever you saw in these few days or weeks, we Kashmiris have been witness of this for ages now. As we were discussing that once the pilot who was landed in or who was captured in Pakistan, we saw that how this was treated and how Indians realized, and they were citing the Geneva Convention. And when we talk about Geneva Convention about Kashmiri political prisoners in Indian occupied Kashmir or the ones who are in Delhi, there is a clear hypocrisy, and the sauce for the goose is not for the gander then. And when we talk about Geneva Convention and when we talk about the UN resolutions, they say that they are old and they are not more applicable. But when it comes to their own person, when he was in Pakistan, the Geneva Convention was all over the social media, and they were telling us and they were telling Pakistanis how to treat a political or a war prisoner. So the thing is that we saw a human shield in Indian occupied Kashmir 2 years back. We saw Farooq Ahmed Dar, who was tied on the army jeep, and he was forced to move around in the cities, and he was shown, and then the army personnel were given the shields. And this is how Indian occupied Kashmir, and this is how Indian army treats Kashmiris every day. This is a humiliation we have to go every day. And then when we tell this to the people of India, when we want some sane voices coming out from India, there are many sane voices. There are who talk about Indian occupation. There are voices who are, for example, Yashwant Sena in his report
Ms.
said that
Shaista, hold on to that thought.
Youth, they are not even...
Hold on to that thought. We also are joined by Dr. Mudasir Firdosi, who is a consultant psychiatrist, joining us from London. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Doctor, so when we were talking about Kashmir, most of our guests reiterated time and time again that whatever we have been seeing, as abnormal as it may be, it was normal for Kashmiris. Tell us about how that impacts the mentality, the psyche, when your normal state is of war.
Well, I think being in a constant state of war changes most of your life if you look at it as a whole. So from being a very kind of peaceful place and then going through the troubles from last 3 decades and so much of trauma and turmoil on day-to-day basis, I think it has got kind of long-term consequences of people living there, children growing up, and how the society overall behaves now, I would say. So if we look at the studies from Kashmir, which there are not many.
And what are these long-term situations that you're talking about, the long-term impacts on the human psyche?
Well, obviously, I think we look at the common mental health problems which have arisen drastically since, and there is no breathing space for people to recover. So, for example, if somebody has developed post-traumatic stress disorder, if the person is always in a constant state of trauma, whatever treatment you give is very unlikely to work. Similarly, there is a constant uncertainty about if your child leaves home, will they come back? If your husband is going to work, is he going to return? And what is going to happen next? Is your family safe? Are you safe? This has kind of affected both, I would say, mental health as well as physical health, like the incidence of diabetes, high blood pressure, other.
And Dr. Mudasir, here when we're talking about how those youths react, how the people of Kashmir react, there's an indigenous movement. How natural is that to come out as an outcome of repression?
Well, obviously, to express our emotions, we are all different. I think what has happened in Kashmir is that there is no kind of outlet to express yourself. There's no even kind of source of entertainment. Pre-90s and now, I think everything is seen from an angle of or a mirror of kind of depression or something you shouldn't do. Like, you can't in Kashmir actually express happiness, and like there's a wedding, there's something going on, and if somebody is doing something to enjoy themselves, people would say, is something wrong with that person? Look what is happening around us, and they are trying to play a song, do this, do that. So clearly, I think then the outcome is either you harm yourself or you kind of express your emotions.
And with Dr. Mudasir, I want to ask Dr. Shazia Malik there, how rare is it for an individual to be happy, to be allowed to feel safe in Kashmir?
As a women's rights activist, I would say that, not just for women, there are opportunities for individuals to entertain themselves, but for women it's more difficult because as community markers, there are more strict limitations on their mobility and what they do. The traditional notions get reinforced on them through a number of ways.
Yes, Dr. Shazia Malik, that is an important point you made there. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Shaista, when we're talking about after the Pulwama attack, how the world is seeing what is happening in Kashmir, something that the Kashmiris have been witnessing for ever since they have been occupied by India. What do you think is going to happen after the elections? What do you think is going to happen as the elections near in India? Will there be more violence?
Look, we were predicting it way before that, before these elections, that this government led by Modi will be doing something to favor them, because whenever there are elections in India, the anti-Pakistan notion and anti-Kashmir notion is really high, and they have to beg for the votes because of these two things. They have to cite things against Pakistan and they have to cite things against Kashmir. They have to label them as terrorists and then ask for the votes that if you don't want your terrorist on your doorstep, vote for BJP. If you don't want this happening in Indian occupied Kashmir or whatever. So these are the things we were predicting already. Pulwama was predicted already, that something will be happening so that they can beg for votes and all this. But the thing is, whenever it comes to Kashmir, whenever it comes to India and Pakistan, the thing is, until and unless this Kashmir dispute is not resolved, things like Pulwama, things like Uri, things like Pathankot, incidents like these will keep on happening. And as I stated earlier, that world is realizing that now, until and unless Kashmir issue is not resolved, things like this will keep on happening, and this warmongering and this hysteria will keep on going. So Kashmir dispute is the elephant in the room that has to be addressed, be it Indian elections, before elections, after elections. Whenever this world wants to see peace in this region, Kashmir dispute has to be addressed.
Yes. Devika, with that, I just want to put the last question to you. The world is seeing how the Modi government has failed, how it has promoted violence, aggression, and how it has promoted war crimes. Has the Indian public seen the same face of the Modi government?
Unfortunately, the Indian government, the Indian public has not been able to see that, because as I was saying, it has been a vicious cycle. We have the Indian narrative, the Indian state narrative, which is always showing that it's only the militancy which is provoking the action which the army is taking. Unfortunately, let's say in other sectors also, there are these all different narratives. Unfortunately, people are only choosing a narrative that they want to see. And that has been the case with the Indian public as well. They don't really have access to know what is happening in Kashmir.
So,
and it's for other people as well, because if we talk about army men, our army men have also been killed, right? It's not like all of them are, let's say, committing these excesses. We have to see it that it has been a vicious cycle. If there has been militancy, there has been the army, then again, of course, because of the army, the militancy comes. We have to end this conflict.
Thank you, Devika. That sends a very pessimistic note, unfortunately, to the world there, that the Indian public still has not seen what we all have seen. Thank you, Devika Mittal, for joining us, Shaista Safi for joining us, Dr. Shazia Malik for joining us, Dr. Mudasir Firdosi for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.